Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome everybody here. My name is Tony Arend. I'm chair of the Department of Government here at Georgetown University. And if people were paying attention to the news early this morning, they know that the Academy Award nominations were announced. And they also know that the movie Oppenheimer was nominated for more awards than any other film. Now, Christopher Nolan, the director of that film, who was also nominated as Best Director, said in an interview that one thing that fascinated him about Oppenheimer came from a song by Sting that was out in the 1980s in the midst of the Cold War. And the line was, "How can I save my little boy from Oppenheimer's deadly toy?" That deadly toy is still out there. And it is proliferated. But not only do we want to save our children from that deadly toy, we want to save our children from the threat of global climate change, of biological weapons, of pandemics, of artificial intelligence gone awry. These are the kinds of threats we face. And so the Doomsday Clock every year assesses these and other threats and tries to determine how far away from midnight we are. Ladies and gentlemen, we are 90 seconds from midnight. We are 90 seconds from midnight in the face of these and other threats. Well, what are these threats? What do they mean for us today? What do they mean for our children? And what can we do to abate these threats and move the hands of the clock back? Those are some of the questions that we are going to be talking about today. We have a very distinguished panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Collin, who is the director of our conflict resolution program at Georgetown, to introduce and moderate the panel. Professor Collin.
Thank you so much, Tony, for that warm welcome. Let me add my welcome to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, who are here today to discuss their 2024 time on the Doomsday Clock. Let me also thank, in advance, our partners in putting today's panel on, including the Department of Government, the Master's Program in American Government, and the Master's Program in Democracy and Governance. There are sibling programs. Again, I'm from the Conflict Resolution Master's Program. I'd also like to thank the Masters at the School of Foreign Service for helping us with today's program. We are all honored to be able to bring you the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and to bring the Bulletin again to Georgetown this year to discuss these existential global threats that we're facing and what they're looking like in 2024. As Professor Arend says, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has been using the Doomsday Clock to communicate how close we are to destroying our world with dangerous technologies of our own making since 1945. And we are here today in 2024 to talk about this 90 seconds to midnight and what kind of sense we can make of it. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your work with our students. Before we get started, let me take this opportunity to remind you to silence your phones, please. We are joined today by 4 members of the Bulletin's Science and Security Board. That's the board, it's my understanding, that actually sets the Doomsday Clock and considers what existential threats belong under our consideration. Before I introduce our panelists, let me just note that Aush George couldn't be with us today. So we're very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Rachel Bronson in her stead. Dr. Rachel Bronson is the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and she's led the Bulletin since 2015. She's been with us here at Georgetown 3 years, and we really enjoy the opportunity to continue our collaboration. Yeah. We're also joined today by Major General Robert Latiff, whose name I keep mispronouncing. He is, amongst other accomplishments, an adjunct professor of ethics at George Mason University and at the University of Notre Dame. He's a consultant on advanced technologies who publishes on the role that technology plays in leading us toward conflict. We're also glad to welcome John Wolfsthal, who is the Director of Global Risk at the Federation of American Scientists and a Senior Adjunct Fellow at the Center for New American Security. He was President Obama's Special Assistant for National Security Affairs and is a former Senior Director at the National Security Council for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. He also taught where I got my master's, at the Monterey Institute. Finally, we are also happy to be joined by Professor Robert Socolow, who is Professor Emeritus at Princeton University, where he was the co-director of the Carbon Mitigation Initiative for 19 years. Professor Socolow is a theoretical physicist, and he began working on and leading interdisciplinary environmental research in the 1970s. So we have representatives of a number of specialties today, and as you know, if you've read the statement from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists on why the clock is set where it's set and where it's set, that we have a number of existential threats under consideration. We'll just have about an hour, maybe a little less than an hour for today's discussion. We'll ask our panelists a few opening questions, and then we'll open up to the room so that we can have a discussion. We really hope to spend most of our time with student questions. So, Dr. Bronson, let me ask you first, what are the themes of this year's statement, and how should we understand our distance to midnight this year? And just to follow up already, what does the Bulletin want people to understand and do with this information?
Great, thank you. I think when I go through this statement, two key themes that jump out to me is the first is the time, that it is still 90 seconds to midnight. We had set it at 90 seconds last year. And important that 90 seconds for us should not, and we hope does not, cause complacency in the sense of, well, it was that last year, so we have nothing to worry about. 90 seconds to midnight is the closest it's ever been to midnight in the whole history of us setting the clock, which first began in 1947. And we mean it when we put it there. We're very thoughtful about thinking about what does it mean in the context of setting it last year, but also in the history of looking at the time. And so the first key theme is that 90 seconds to midnight is very dangerous. It's unsustainable. And if the current environment feels to you unsettled, worrisome, seeming to be going in the wrong directions, we agree. That's what 90 seconds feels like. And the second is that technology is advancing beyond our ability to govern it at the moment, which is, we were founded by scientists, we're composed of scientists. We're very bullish on science. Science is going to bring huge advancements. We're all working towards advancements that will help healthcare worldwide, will help make us safer, will bring information to places in new ways that never had access before. But at the same time, if we're not responsible about it, it's going to bring grave dangers and risks. And we have to be able to hold both of those in our heads and figure out here at Georgetown how to govern those technologies. I think it's best evident in artificial intelligence right now, that we're right, it's artificial intelligence Oppenheimer moment, if you will. And we can see all of the positives that AI will bring, but that doesn't mean we can discount all of the risks. And that's our job, is to advocate for policies that mitigate those risks so that we can reap all of the benefits. So I think those two themes, that 90 seconds is unstable and dangerous, and that technologies is moving very quickly, will bring huge gains, but unless really global governance is advanced much more robustly and quickly, it's going to be very, very dangerous. And these technologies will have, the negative, we fear, will outweigh the benefits. So I think trying to think about the then second part of your question, which was what does the bulletin intend to do at the time? Was that the?
Yeah. What's the what do you want us to do with the message that you're giving?
So, and I think I'll just kind of put it out there because I'm really interested in, as we get to Q&A, your thoughts on what the time should be and why. My colleagues here know that we start the meeting each year saying, is humanity safer or at greater risk this year compared to last year? And this year compared to the 75 years or so we've been asking the question. And so what we would like you to take away from it is, first of all, to kind of ask the question or chat with your friends about it. Like, do you think we got it right? If you were setting the time, what time would you set it at 4 minutes to midnight? Would you set it at 2 hours to midnight? Would you have moved it closer? Why or why not? So what do you think the time should be? And what do you put into that calculation? If you were setting this clock, so we define this clock as man-made technology and its effect on of life on Earth as we know it. So when we look at that, nuclear risk and climate change are the two existential threats that we've identified as such and focus on. But we keep our eyes on new disruptive technologies. We're spending a lot of time thinking about the governance around pathogen research, mis and disinformation, and how this fits into being able to solve some of these challenges. And when we look at, those are the kinds of technologies that we kind of put on the table and try to figure out, well, what's happened in the last year and what's happened across history. And so are those, if you were setting the clock, are those what you would, kind of the ingredients you would put into it? If not, what are we missing? Or what would you include? And also, where would you set it? Are we being too extreme? We don't think so. We're very concerned, and you'll hear why. But what are you seeing? Are you more optimistic? Are you less optimistic? That conversation, I think, is the most important part of the clock. If we can start that conversation or give you a tool to have that conversation, I think that's the first step of agency. And the first step in all of us figuring out what is our part, our small little part in trying to make the planet a safer place.
Thank you. On that note, I want to turn to John Wolfsthal and ask you about nuclear weapons, which is the organizing principle originally for the Bulletin. Where do you think nuclear weapon proliferation, non-proliferation is? How worried are you at this moment in time? What does 2024 look like for you?
So for the next 3 hours, I'll explain. First, let me just say thank you for hosting and for Tony and for Georgetown. And it's a real pleasure to be here with my colleagues from the Bulletin. To save time, I'll put this as simply as I can, which is we've now seen from Rob and Bob's generation through mine, an ebb and flow of the role that nuclear weapons play in the world. Before I was born and when these gentlemen were starting out, nuclear weapons were the defining issue in international security. The United States and Soviet Union facing each other in the Cold War, ready and projecting a readiness to destroy each other and the rest of the world with them in 30 minutes or less. That's the world I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s. And for 20 years, that threat ebbed. During the 1990s and 2000s, it was not a prominent feature. We were, I wouldn't say as aggressively as possible, pursuing elimination, but we were in a different environment where nuclear weapons simply weren't as central to American security and to global security. They didn't go away. And we saw other countries interested in these weapons, other countries had acquired them, but they weren't really the currency of power and security. And that is fundamentally what has changed over the last 10 years. And particularly since the invasion of Ukraine, not because war is suddenly new, we've had wars going on throughout that period, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, which we tend not to pay too much attention to, although others do. But in the Northern Hemisphere and the great powers where nuclear weapons were still relevant, nuclear weapons have come roaring back as both an instrument for foreign policy and security, and in the minds of many countries, a means for ensuring their security. And there have been and there will continue to be debates about whether nuclear weapons are the source of our security or the source of our insecurity. Hopefully you have some of those discussions amongst yourselves and friends. But that's still a debate going on that started with the origins of the Manhattan Project. And you see it play out in other conversations around AI or biological developments, whether we're behind or ahead. Well, if we have to invest in these things now because we don't, somebody else will. But that predominantly is what has changed over the last couple of years, that Russia, the United States, American allies, China, Pakistan, India, other countries see nuclear weapons as important for not only who they are, but ensuring their existence. And as that grows, nuclear weapons become more relevant to doomsday because they remain, to this day, the most powerful weapons that humanity has ever conceived of, and one of the few, if not the only means for humanity to destroy itself. And that's really at the core of the Bulletin, that these are things of our creation, but we have the means to control them and eliminate them if we get it right. But the challenge with nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence and nuclear security is you have to get it right every single time. And I don't know how many of you have encountered human beings. Some of them are flawed. All of them are flawed. And even the brightest, best intentioned, most capable people managing nuclear weapons in the United States, in Russia, in China, in France, in Great Britain, every country that has them has screwed up at some point. And that's where we see these fundamental challenges, the role of nuclear weapons and the risk that we will get it wrong.
I have follow-up questions, but
I have 2 hours and 45 minutes left.
General Latiff, let me ask you about artificial intelligence. We've been hearing about disruptive technologies. The statement lists a number of disruptive technologies, particularly biological technologies. There's a statement that artificial intelligence is going to accelerate risks associated with other emerging technologies. It seems like there's two sides of the AI debate, right? Some people think that AI is going to actually move the hands of the clock back in the other direction, right? And be something that helps us save ourselves.
It could.
And some people think that it's an existential risk. So how should we be thinking about that? How do you think about that?
So that's interesting you mentioned that last point. There's a great debate going on as to whether or not AI is an existential risk. I, for one, don't think it is. AI is a tool, although it's taken on an aura of being a weapon on its own. But so I don't think it's existential on its own. The problem that we face is the impact of AI on those other disruptive technologies. And you mentioned biology. There's news articles about the ability of AI to design pathogens that we had never even considered. And that obviously portends another pandemic and so on and so forth. So the application of artificial intelligence in those other fields could be good or it could be bad. And we worry that it's going to have a negative effect, a disruptive effect. Then there's, of course, the long-standing issue of AI in weapons. Lethal autonomous weapons is typically what it's referred to. But in all kinds of weaponry, AI is appearing, which is, again, it could be good because it can make the weapons more accurate, but it can also make them autonomous, and there are issues of trust with artificial intelligence. The one I worry the most about, coming from a military background, is command and control. And it's happening. AI is all over military command and control systems. Fortunately, at this point, we don't think it's in nuclear command and control systems, but at some point it probably will be. And that it ends up being a huge concern. And then, of course, we could go through, and I won't spend the time going through all of the weaknesses of artificial intelligence systems. the vulnerabilities to hacking, the dependence on data, which may or may not be, as we've seen with ChatGPT, it can be poisoned. And so we think that the AI as a technology is dangerous. And as was mentioned, I think in the statement, world leaders are not doing enough. Europe is doing pretty well, but in the US, all we've done is basically put out pronouncements without very much teeth in them. So I think that's it.
I mean, it's interesting comparing nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence. If we think about what we want is robust governance, right? And it has to be global governance. I mean, artificial intelligence, it makes me think of Asimov's 3 laws, right? If we could embed that somewhere, right? But that has to be global governance. And nuclear weapons, you see governance eroding. And artificial intelligence, you see it not yet present.
Right.
Which brings me to Professor Socolow. To ask you a question about climate change, where maybe we see one of the most active regimes of global governance really guiding our policies. The Doomsday Clock statement today refers to the mixed record this year on global efforts to address climate change. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that record as mixed and what makes you hopeful when it comes to combating climate change?
Sure. I was inclined to inject that we're seeing the teething of global governance around climate change. First, I want to say I'm looking out at you with an excitement. I rarely have an opportunity to talk to a group of people whom I see as future leaders across the board in the American society and maybe societies of other countries, international organizations. We talk about, to the average person, say, go out and vote. Well, you can say, go out and lead. You can't say that to an ordinary group. But so about 20 of us set the clock. We meet in November. We spend a whole day. We take straw votes. We work it out. It wasn't easy to keep the clock at the same time. It's sort of boring from a news standpoint. But we felt that we had moved it the year before, and things hadn't gotten a whole lot worse relative to what the Ukraine war in particular that had started in the previous year. When we take the climate, and it's a completely amorphous and improvisational process. It's like throwing things into a pot and stirring it. So where did climate change come into that? I talk about the ratchet with climate change. Every year will be worse than the one before for quite a while if the measure is the amount of how much greenhouse gas is in the atmosphere, what the consequent impacts are, because we're a long way from hardly bending the curve of emissions versus time, or concentration versus time. We need to bend it all the way over to flat and eventually come down. So there's 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, meaning 420 molecules of the air or CO2. Before we came in this room, it's up a little bit now because we've been breathing. And it's going up about 2 per year, about 0.5% per year. And that's been going on. So do we take that into account and say the world is more dangerous every year? We certainly could. I tend to say that's background. What really matters is our capacity to address the problem, because that can go up or down, and it seems more matched to the assignment we have. And what's improved for this year, it kind of balanced out in my mind. We are more aware, internationally, nationally, domestic conversation is more aware than a year before. And the amount of press attention, the amount of government attention, the amount that will be discussed this coming year in the election will be actually quite large, I suspect, maybe quite interesting. And the other is the deployment of renewable energy, wind and solar, very large capital investments going on all over the world. It is a competitive technology. Certainly now, as it takes market share at the 10 and 20% level, it will have its own problems as it becomes larger. On the other side, it started a year before, but the price of fossil energy went way up with the Ukraine war, the readjustments of the supply chains and whatnot, which made the profits of the fossil energy industries higher, which meant that they are fairly large players in the climate space, and they were less interested. Their shareholders were penalizing them for being interested in alternatives. So there was a fading of commitment this past year in the fossil energy world for dealing with climate change compared to drill, baby, drill. And the other thing we talked about last year, I don't know that it was worse, but the Ukraine war really led to a deterioration of the capacity and the appetite for dealing with global issues. The Russian-American relationship had been very important in building confidence in dealing with climate change. The Chinese-American relationship even more so. And we've had a lot of slippage. I would put neither to the left nor to the right now, neither pan of the justice, something which I think must develop further, and it's going to be in your lives to do it, which is the global south. Most of the emission, almost the entire emission growth in the world is in the global south. It's kind of leveled out in Europe and the US, Australia, Japan. They're not growing. It's the global south, whereas as they develop, and they develop with fossil fuels, unless we really work very hard for that not to happen. So that commitment to help them invest in green paths, avoid lock-in, there's a lot to do, and it really isn't happening yet. If you watch the TV, or if you do watch the TV from this morning, I have a colleague, Ambush Sagar, who was talking to us from Delhi. He's deeply committed to, and effectively committed to getting us to think harder about the commitments, the requirements to make something serious happen in the developing world as far as emissions are concerned. A message I want to leave you with, you're in a political science department, many of you, and I want to encourage you all to study science, natural science, not be afraid of it. Make sure you know how to learn it. Go to square one and square two. You're immediately a much bigger player in the conversation when you do know something. Take an extra course and just hang out with science friends and learn the greenhouse problem can be explained in half an hour. When you ask questions back at us, don't give up on that stuff. Don't disconnect yourselves. The world would be a lot better a lot more dangerous, let me say, if all the people running the governments have say science is done by somebody else. And we're not that far from that state of affairs. And then the other is, your generation, I hope, will continue to challenge the nation state as the only way of organizing our thinking about international relations. Rachel mentioned global governance. The climate is the problem for global governance. The CO2 gets stirred in the atmosphere, no matter where you put it up. Within a few months, the CO2 concentration has risen uniformly. Doesn't stay patchy for very long. And so cosmopolitan thinking, planetary identity is a phrase I like to use. We've got to go past the nation state in this area and in all the others we're talking about, even as we accept the nation state as maybe the principal way of getting things done. It can't be the only way. So that's your job. Thanks.
Just needed a second with that final recommendation.
Actually,
Yeah.
you finished up with study science, right? And bypass the nation state as the only actor. But other than that, you guys have an easy.
It is what you have to do. I'm sorry. We didn't do a great job. We're passing the baton. You've got a huge agenda.
I love this as a call to action. And let me turn it over to you. Let's respond. Maybe not about the nature of the nation state, but about the nature of other ways to get to governance, right? That's one of the themes I think that we're talking about today. What we'd like to do with questions is to ask you to line up at the microphone if you have a question. And we're going to take them in batches, so 3 at a time, unless, of course, we're all feeling shy, in which case I have a second round. That's great. 3 of mine. Let me remind you and prompt you. Dr. Bronson started us out with a prompt to think about, how optimistic are you compared with the Bulletin, right? Do you feel more or less like we're in the right place here? Are 90 seconds to midnight the closest it's ever been to doomsday? Do we feel like we understand what man-made existential threats are? Do we agree with this basket? Do we want to expand it?
What's on your minds?
Thank you.
Whoa.
There we go. Okay.
Hi, my name's Allie Graves. I'm in the Conflict Resolution Program with Professor Collin. So my question is, you all have kind of spoken about the call to action for our generation and how solving these issues are very much a problem of governance. And one of the things that I've kind of found in my studies so far is that when people are scared, it's a lot harder for them to solve complex problems. So from what you have seen in all your experience, what path forward do you see in our ability to overcome our human nature in order to solve these problems? Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and for all of your wonderful insights. My name is Aush. I'm a sophomore in the undergraduate SFS program studying culture and politics. A lot of the studies that I do focus especially on the populations and especially marginalized populations of the world. One question that I wanted to ask was, in the methodology of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, who is 90 seconds away from midnight? Arguably, some of the communities, especially islander communities, indigenous communities, have already suffered the impacts of nuclear weapons testing. AI is being used in police precincts across the country with negative effects on Black and Brown communities. Who is 90 seconds away? How should we interpret that? How is that adopted into the methodology? Thank you.
Hello, thank you for coming here. I think it's always awesome to see in person the people you've grown up, whose work you've grown up reading. So thanks again. I'm David Kepsey, second-year MBA student. I'm curious. One of the critiques I feel like I've heard levied against the Doomsday Clock is that we're closer to midnight now than we were during the times of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I've grown up reading was the closest time we've come to the end of the world. So I'm curious. Is the reason we're closer to midnight now because the information available to us, there's more data, we're more aware of the threats, or are we actually closer to midnight now than we were during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Thank you.
3 excellent questions. So we have, how do we solve problems if we're afraid? What are the pathways there in human behavior? Who is 90 seconds away? Is it all of us or is it some of us? And now compared to previous times, is this an information effect or something objective? General.
Just a brief, maybe it's just a pushback a little bit on the first question about fear. I actually see it differently. I think when people are afraid, they're more motivated actually to make change. At least in my professional experience, that's been true. You don't sit around and think about something that's frightening you. You try to do something about it. And I actually think that's what we're trying to do here, is maybe not scare people, but at least get them thinking about the problems that are facing them. So I would, perhaps in a side conversation, I would like to hear why it is that the student thinks that that fear paralyzes you.
Well, I'd like to take that other side. I think that was a very important question.
Yeah.
Especially, one of the things I worry about is frightening people too much about climate change, especially the younger generation, which despairs, doesn't want to have children, bring them into this dangerous world that we're followed by we don't want to have a super growing, fast growing population for environmental reasons. We don't want it to fall apart either. And I think we can scare people too much to make them believe that it's already locked in. The planet will become uninhabitable. It's not locked in. There is hype, especially in the climate side, about how bad things are. That is troublesome to me for exactly that reason, that it can become incapacitating. The environmental justice question is also very important. Who's 90 seconds from midnight? We are averaging over absolutely everybody. We are concentrating on effects which will affect rich and poor in a comparable way for the most part, acknowledging that there are distributional issues. Climate impacts are not uniform. The poorer you are, the more they're going to hurt you. You don't have health services, you don't have insurance, you don't have education, warning systems. There's a lot which make the consequences of climate change, or, God forbid, some kind of nuclear war that was not all out, there would be very definitely greater effects on the poorest people. So environmental justice issues do point to taking these issues more seriously, not less. And let me leave to the others. Are we comfortable saying that we were not closer to midnight at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis? That's a stimulating question. I haven't made myself think about it in a while, so pass it to one of you.
Well, as the nuclear expert, but not one who was born in 1962, I'll take this one. If we were facing a bilateral nuclear situation, I think it'd be hard to say, this is more dangerous, right? The United States and Soviet Union were, even more than they knew at the time, stumbling into a nuclear war. I've gotten to do fun stuff in my life. In the late 1990s, I hosted Robert McNamara and Ted Sorensen in Moscow for the Russian premiere of 13 Days, the Kevin Costner movie on the movie. And Robert McNamara met a former Soviet submarine commander who told him he had been pre-delegated authority to use nuclear weapons that he had on board, which is something that even 30 years after the fact, he hadn't learned before. So, the idea of perfect knowledge is something that leaders often think they have, and nobody ever has. So the problem is, for us, it's not a bilateral nuclear relationship. And asking about disproportionate effects of climate change, nuclear war between India and Pakistan worries us a lot, just as nuclear war between the United States and Russia worries us. And so the fact that you're dealing with active military conflict in Ukraine, you have border disputes, the possibility of India and China still engaging in conflict, India, Pakistan, nobody knows what's going to happen in Europe. Those are all the dynamics. And then you throw into it the destabilizing technology. So if it were just Kennedy and Khrushchev picking up the phone and trying to work something out, things moved a little slower. When you're being fed data through your early warning network that's controlled by machine learning and is displaying information that can be real or can be a simulation tape that nobody's realized you put into the live feed, which actually happened.
1979.
So, the problems get more worse, they metastasize. But you can't say this one situation is worse, but if you look at the overall situation, I think we're all pretty comfortable saying this is a less manageable situation and one that we're not taking seriously and we haven't put the tools in place to manage.
Good answer.
When we talk about, in conflict resolution, we talk about what makes conflicts difficult to resolve. Making them more and more complex and bringing actors in is one of the things that increases the difficulty of conflict management exponentially. Yeah.
I knew I should have gone to Georgetown.
Did you want to?
I mean, I can jump in, just picking up on that last point. I think there's another piece of this, is that the Cuban Missile Crisis so terrified leaders at the time that they quickly focused their attention, and they quickly put into place a process by which we would end up entering into what some have referred to as a golden age of arms control, right? A sense that it was so dangerous and we had pushed ourselves so close to a catastrophic nuclear exchange that we had to do something about it. What we're saying, I think, with this time recognizing that there's multiple areas that we're now concerned with, it's more complicated, more actors, is that we know better than this. We are dismantling all of the architecture that was put in place to reduce proliferation and the desire to have nuclear weapons. And in many ways, we're back in that 1950s era when it comes to global governance around nuclear issues. And we know better, and it's harder now. So there are parallels to where we had been, how we address those issues, and where we find ourselves now, that even in the nuclear space, I think you can make that argument, and we're not just limiting ourselves to the nuclear space.
I'm Josh. I'm also in the conflict resolution program. I wanted to ask more of a question along the lines of optimism. The work that really kind of all of us do, and especially you guys, like I imagine that day in November is not a particularly happy, jovial pizza party. But this could be... Bagels, awesome. It can be daunting and at times very depressing work, and so I'm curious, what are the bright spots? Like, yes, it's still 90 seconds, but it's not 60 seconds or 40 seconds or 30 seconds. Yeah. So what are the things where are those bright spots, those moments of progress that we're seeing, that for those of us who want to do this work and make lifelong careers of this work can kind of latch onto and be like, oh, we're not screwed.
Yeah.
How do you stay optimistic?
Hello, everyone. I'm Naresu. Thank you so much for making the time. I'm not here. I'm a senior at George Washington, so I ran up for the chance to speak to you all. Thank you once again. So the question I had was, you guys mentioned the 60s, and President Kennedy said that we must bring the power to destroy any nation under the absolute power of all nations. And now we have leading politicians calling for an Iron Dome around the United States. So I wanted to actually ask you all what the implications you think are for the lack of faith, lack of trust in global governance institutions like the United Nations. And do you believe that, do you think these institutions are outdated, or do you think there's still hope for, states around the world to work through these institutions to forge peace and, prevent a nuclear war?
Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Ryan. I'm a first-year security studies student here at Georgetown, and my question concerns nuclear weapons. One of the things that we talk a lot about in our classes is the rise of great power competition once again. And so my question is that if diplomacy fails and we find ourselves in the worst, the US stumbles into a war with China, for example, is it possible to have a conventional war that does not escalate to the use of nuclear weapons, or is the idea of a conventional war between nuclear powers that doesn't escalate a fantasy? Thank you.
Should we start with nuclear?
Sure. I wake up and think about nukes, so it's totally fine with me. I think the last question is, since you're taking a class and it's really complex, but I'll give you the basic answer, which is, yeah, it's conceivable. The United States and Russia, the United States and China have been engaged in proxy wars. Americans have died by Chinese weapons. Chinese and Russians have died by American weapons. So the challenge with escalation is there's intentional and inadvertent. US policy remains to this day that if we are engaged in a conventional war and we begin to lose, or our extreme interests are threatened, we reserve the right to escalate to the nuclear level. Some people think that that is a firm commitment and that we would follow through. Other people think that that's not a credible threat. And we debate this, and we've debated this in nuclear policy for as long as we had two nuclear powers. The idea being, well, really, you're going to start a nuclear war with Russia. They could fire back. It can escalate. You're basically saying you care more than they do. They care more than you do. So the intentional escalation is a challenge. The inadvertent escalation is one that we have tried to create some rules and norms around over the decades, and Rachel is right. The things that we learned, like you should have the ability to pick up the phone and call your counterpart, is really important. Because maybe that ship didn't mean to ram your ship, or maybe that aircraft didn't mean to down your aircraft. We have tried to have those conversations with Russia. They've now cut most of those off. We've tried to have those conversations with China. They don't want to have those conversations with us for a number of reasons. So it is possible that we can get into a conflict, but I would prefer not to test those limits because we don't know. And again, there's no such thing as perfect knowledge. You don't know how that situation will unfold. I want to just touch on Nirasu's question. Nirasu, you should apply to Georgetown. It was a really good question. Although GW has a good master's program too, it's fine.
He doesn't need to go to Georgetown, he's at GW.
He's a senior GW, which means he's got to go to grad school, and I want him, you know. So either way, you're good. See, they're already fighting over you. This is good. You know, I disagree a little bit on the governance question, right? So rules, treaties, the UN are reflections of national commitment to adopt norms, and in some cases, to cede parts of their sovereignty over to a collective body. And in history, we have ebbed and flowed on that. And in the United States right now in particular, there's a real ebb. There isn't a lot of desire to cede sovereignty because people feel personally, in community, and nationally challenged. That being said, I can point the finger at lots of countries that I feel have not kept the faith, but there's a lot of blame to go around here. And the question is, getting back to the fear, what's going to motivate countries to recognize that we have to solve this problem together? Climate, that's quite easy. Nuclear, it's very hard. AI and advanced technology, there are some hopes. Maybe we can get there. One of the areas that the Bulletin doesn't do, but I do in my day job, is planetary defense. I love planetary defense because it requires global action. No one country is capable of doing that for detection. So, but
You mean asteroids and things of that sort?
Near Earth objects, right? Not aliens, although you never know. So, you know, the question is, what comes first, the governance and then the solution, or the desire to create a solution and the governance? And I think in different issue areas, there'll be different roles for that. Sorry to go on a little longer.
I would just like to comment on the question about the UN. One of the things you said was, you know, should we just give up on these institutions? And our friend here talked about our advanced age. One thing about having been around for so long, you see things ebb and flow. And you know, while the UN may not be burning things up right now, it provides a forum. And one thing that's important is that there's always a forum for discussion. Sometimes it shines a bright light on bad actors, which is also very good. So, you know, wait another 25 years and the UN will rise again. I wouldn't give up on international institutions and always keep talking.
Let me add just a couple of things. The optimism relative to a year ago was that Putin, in some sense, had backed off on his, it seems less likely than it did a year ago that he could actually not be impeded by his own thinking and by the people around him to use a nuclear weapon. Not to zero. It's an echo of the Oppenheimer movie there about getting to zero. But less. The Iron Dome for the U.S., I hadn't heard that, but it brings back the Reagan era of the discussions of the ABM, the anti-ballistic missile. It's not going to be perfect, no matter what we build. And if nuclear weapons are aiming at us and we get 80% of them from hitting us and blow them up in the sky, that just isn't good enough. So I hope we don't get into this, we know how to make ourselves invulnerable. Watch the Israelis, they didn't get every one of the ones going at them with their so-called Iron Dome. So I hope we don't go down the ABM for security game again, which and read the Reagan period, you'll see what went on there. The question I worry about, very similar to the question that Ryan asked, but not quite the same. Can you stop an escalation? Can you stop escalating to nuclear when you have a conventional war? And you got answers. We should have more breaks than we do, is what I heard. But the next question: if Putin were to use a nuclear weapon somewhere, or somebody else would, do we have breaks do we have fire breaks or missing rungs in the ladder to go from a nuclear weapon to all-out nuclear war that we're really confident about? And with my colleagues, I have been unable to get somebody to put their hand on my shoulder and say, don't worry about this. they do worry about this. And I find it astonishing that we have not actually collectively figured out that the thing that would destroy civilization, nuclear weapon on a city would be absolutely horrible, but a destruction of civilization means hundreds of weapons. And can we really not figure out how to go from not go from A to B? Figure it out, guys.
I want to come back to the optimism question, the first one. My colleague Daniel Holtz, who's the chair of the Science and Security Board, we have a piece out in USA Today that is a little off-brand because it kind of focuses on some optimism that I just wanted to kind of share with you. When we look out, it's 90 seconds to midnight, that is kind of doomy, fair enough. That's on brand. But the optimism, what we write about is if you look in these areas, there are actions being taken to minimize these threats that are real. And we write about them too in the statement. So in climate, we do focus a lot of our attention on the incredible acceleration of renewables. It's not enough. We need to do more. We've heard about it on the panel. But there were some steps taken at COP in the last meeting, as well as what's happening in the private sector, as what we're seeing politically, the fact that you're seeing more and more attention to climate change, maybe less here in the States than elsewhere, but we are seeing a lot of activity. And we need more of it. It needs to be faster. We're not keeping up with the demands of climate change. But when I was having a conversation with Aush, one of the things we were talking about is what, in a sense, our generation had to fight here, especially in the States, was, is climate change real? They're still having that debate in certain pockets, but it's nowhere near where it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And globally, Rob, a few years ago in our conversations, you were pointing out political parties in Europe and how climate change is entering into it more easily and everything like that, and you were much more optimistic. So you can look in the climate space, and again, we would still calculate we are not doing enough, but there are really important initiatives globally and on the ground. In artificial intelligence, this year has been a roller coaster for artificial intelligence, but what you saw at incredible speeds was an attempt by the US government, the British government. You saw the UN taking it on, really trying to understanding the risks and trying to figure out the beginnings of how are we going to regulate this? Who's going to regulate it? What is it going to look like? Where do you need? And so in all these international institutions as well as national governments, you see real efforts being done. The private sector is calling for regulation. They don't want to personally be regulated, but they want their competitors to be regulated. But there's this kind of recognition that more needs to be done that has kind of happened as quickly as the risks have become apparent. Again, not fast enough, it's not keeping up, but I think in that realm, real areas to look at private sector, public sector attention to it. And then in the nuclear area, I think where it's kind of most bleak, quite frankly, even then you have this, the TPNW, which is a global effort to make nuclear weapons illegal. Even on our board, there's real differences on how important it is. Is it actually counterproductive? But there is a sense that globally people are mobilizing behind that in a way that we haven't seen in decades. And so all of these kind of point to areas where work is being done, people are focusing on it and pushing back. It just needs to be faster. So I think it's important on the optimism because I'm not as worried about scaring people into paralysis because I think people are feeling scared and unsettled by the realities. And I think that when we come out and say it's 90 seconds to midnight, I think a lot of people are like, yeah, that's what I thought. Like, it is not going well, right? But there are things that we can all do. And we can't all fix all problems, and not one of us is going to solve any of the problems, but these problems don't get solved unless people are involved. And so we need to pick what motivates us and get behind that and engage, because others are out there trying to make a difference. And then just finally, the question, coming back to the question on multilateral organizations, I think this is a pretty phenomenal time to be studying these issues, because our current structures are old and they're not clearly responding to the needs of today. So what are they going to look like, right? It's not okay just to say, well, this treaty doesn't work anymore, so we're just going to rip it up, which is what we've been doing, right? But it's that, okay, so what does this need to look like if we're going to reduce the clear acceleration of nuclear weapons? Because we need some new ideas, not because people haven't been at this problem, it's because the world's changing really quickly. So it's a pretty phenomenal time to be studying all these issues, because they're changing right now, and the answers aren't clear. So it's not like 20 years ago when this was all baked in and everyone knew what this kind of would look like. It's all open season, so it's a pretty exciting time. A bit terrifying to be kind of thinking about these issues, and that's why we keep imploring you to help figuring out, not because I think we've been irresponsible in well, I don't know, you guys do it, but because the issues are changing, and so we need new ideas.
It is 3:30, so I think I'm going to leave it here at the opportunity for action, the fact that we need it, it's terrifying, and it's exciting, right? That we're going to make new things. Your generation is going to make new things to address these problems. So, can you please join me in thanking Dr. Bronson, General Latiff, Mr. Wolfsthal, and Professor Socolow for being with us today. Thank you so much.
Great.
Katie,
Thank you.
for having us.
It was great. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.